Welcome to The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, we're going to be looking at a question about phenomenal conservatism, and I'm joined by an expert on this topic who did a book on it, Dr. Chris Tucker. Hello, Dr. Tucker.
Hey, good to see you.
He is a professor of philosophy at William & Mary, and we've done an interview on phenomenal conservatism that you can check out. So this is a question that came in from someone who watched that interview. I have a concern with phenomenal conservatism. This concern is meta-justificatory. That's a hard word to say. I'm not sure that seemings are capable of conferring justification. This is due to the fact that by phenomenal conservatism's own admission, they only confer prima facie justification, meaning that they do not necessarily connect with truth. Something could seem to be true and yet fail to be true. But if that is the case, then why think that they usually connect with truth? Why think that they ever do? And here's the big part. You can't appeal to the fact that it seems that seemings usually connect to truth on pain of circularity. But then what is the justification for thinking that a seeming is an indication of truth? All right. If you want, you can just briefly say what phenomenal conservatism is and then launch into the answer to the question.
Sure. Yeah. Phenomenal conservatism is just the idea that you should stick to the way things seem unless you have a good reason otherwise. In other words, you should believe the way things seem to you unless you have counter evidence of some kind. So, if it seems to you that if you ever seen a Mueller-Lyer display, I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing that right, but the two little lines, it looks to everyone, even if you know it is an illusion, that the two horizontal lines are the same length. But, we know from when you pull the ruler out that they're not the same length. So in that case, you shouldn't stick to the way things seem because you've got really good counter evidence. But in general, the idea behind phenomenal conservatism is that reasonable people believe the way things seem unless they've got a good reason not to. Now, the question, I think, is really onto something here. But we first need to get clear about exactly what prima facie justification is. So a prima facie justification doesn't really have a direct connection to whether the justification is connected to truth or not. Justification is prima facie insofar as counter evidence can outweigh or undermine that justification. In this sense, some evidence E could guarantee the truth of something and still be prima facie, because even a justification that guarantees the truth of something, you can still get evidence that it's unreliable, or evidence that if it's a deductive proof, if all the relevant experts tell you you've made a mistake, you can still have good reason not to accept that proof, even if it is a perfectly legitimate proof. So the prima facie qualifier doesn't tell us anything about how justification is connected to truth or not, whether it's reliable or not. It tells us whether the justification has already taken into account counter evidence or not. So what phenomenal conservatism is saying is, when it says seemings or prima facie justification, it's saying, look, we're not taking a stand yet on whether this particular seeming responds to all relevant counter evidence. We're just saying, look, stick to the seeming provides a good reason before you take into account that counter evidence, and that counter evidence may or may not overturn it. Okay, so the second thing, my ultimate response, the questioner has in a way predicted. There is going to be an element of circularity, but in my response, so I want to begin by saying a little bit about different kinds of circularity. Not all kinds of circularity are equally bad. So take, for example, premise circularity. Now, I'm an extremely stylish individual, so I came prepared. My wardrobe has an example of premise circular reasoning. Circular reasoning works because circular reasoning works. This is going to get you nowhere. This is a bad way to reason. It can't justify its conclusion. But the circularity there is where the premise is the conclusion. But there are other kinds of circularity that are less bad, right? So it is possible to know that all your faculties are reliable. And you could know that all of your faculties are reliable by relying on some faculty of yours, whatever faculty that is. Now, that's a type of circularity that some folks call epistemic circularity. I mean, if you want to reflect on your ability to know anything at all, you have to rely on some faculty of yours. So if you want to reflect on all of your faculties at once, there's going to be some element of circularity there. And even God cannot get outside of the circularity. If God wants to reflect on how reliable his knowledge is, he's got to be doing it by relying on one of his faculties. So any epistemology that allows you or God to know that all of your faculties are reliable will allow epistemic circularity to be okay in some circumstances. Hence, epistemic circularity can be okay. So third, you can know that your seemings are reliable by relying on your seemings. Maybe it seems to you that your seemings are reliable. Maybe there's more complicated arguments that ultimately boil down to your seemings. So, but I mean, I guess I'm inclined to think, for example, my perceptual seemings. I mean, it seems pretty obvious to me that my perceptual seemings are reliable. And again, that's circular, but it's epistemic rather than premise circular. Now, there's nothing we can do to make epistemic circularity seem okay, right? It's always arguments that convince the experts that epistemic circularity can be okay. And just about any, I think every epistemology endorses some kinds of epistemic circularity. And it's even the case that some experts began by ridiculing epistemologies that endorsed epistemic circularity, only to have people point out that their own views explicitly endorsed epistemic circularity. So the best epistemologies, they're in the same boat with phenomenal conservatism. But you know what else is in the same boat as phenomenal conservatism? Science, right? If science wants to know whether some scientific method is reliable, usually they rely on some scientific method or another. For example, in the form of replicability studies to determine the reliability of its own methods. So even science uses science to determine whether it's reliable. Even science approves of a certain kind of circularity, epistemic circularity, not premise circularity, not the kind on my shirt.
Perfect. So it sounded like the answer had kind of two big parts. One was just to get clear about what we mean by, I always get, I say prima facie, but maybe that's incorrect. But that's just, my understanding is, on the face of it, gives you a reason, an initial reason to believe something before you have considered all the evidence. Am I right about that?
That's right. Just say it's prima facie is just to say it's a little bit of evidence.
Yeah, just a little bit of evidence. Okay.
And you might have, it's not your total evidence. It's just a little bit of evidence. And when you take into account all your evidence, it might get overruled.
Yeah. Okay. So to say you're prima facie justified just means, hey, you've got a little bit of evidence, and on the basis of that, you're justified. But hey, things could come along that outweigh that, and that's fine. So just getting clear on that. And the second part of the answer was there's a difference between logical circularity and epistemic circularity, and the many, if not all, and maybe you can correct me on that, maybe you want to say all epistemologies end up in this epistemic circularity boat.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think let's put it this way. I can't think of a single expert that says no form of epistemic circularity is okay. There is a debate about which particular instances of epistemic circularity are okay. And it gets complicated, and some of it is complicated enough that it's a little bit above my head. But when you get down to the general, are some kinds of epistemic circularity okay? The experts generally agree in epistemology that at least some instances are okay. And again, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say and you say, and if you're still, a little bit skeptical, think about science. Science does this very thing, and they seem okay with it. So
Yeah.
we're on board.
Yeah, and I'll just say, again, think about Mueller-Lyer illusion. Even when you know it's an illusion, the lines still look the same length. Or is it one looks longer? I can't even remember. Maybe I'm misremembering the analogy. But even when you know something is an illusion, it can still be illusory, right? Even when you know that some forms of epistemic circularity are okay, they can all seem bad, right? That's just the nature of these intellectual illusions. Things often seem true, and then it gets overruled by additional evidence. And I think that's what happens in the epistemic circularity case. It seems bad, but then when you consider all the evidence that's relevant, you've got to be okay with some forms.
Yeah. So to just put that question up, and then we'll end. The question was, what is the justification for thinking that a seeming is an indication of truth? Your answer is a seeming. It just seems to me that seemings usually connect to truth, but that's just a case of epistemic circularity that seems right in line with the use of my cognitive faculties to come to the belief that my cognitive faculties are reliable.
Well, yeah, I mean that particular seeming will be part of it, but there's, I think all reasoning ultimately boils down to seemings. So no matter what kind of reasoning you do to try to show that seemings are connected to the truth or reliable, you're going to ultimately appeal to seemings at some point, even if it's not as obvious and bald-faced as it seems to me that my seemings are reliable.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tucker, for answering that question. And for those that want to explore this distinction between logical circularity and epistemic circularity in more depth, that is the next video in this Ask a Scholar series. We're joined by Dr. Andrew Moon to examine that more closely. So check that out now. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.